Welcome to the Texas Conflict Coach radio program. If you have ever experienced or engaged in destructive or unresolved conflict, then you know it leads to broken relationships, distrust, and damaging results. Our program will help you manage and resolve conflict effectively with strategies, valuable resources, and support. I am your host, Pattie Porter. My guest hosts, Dina Zameta and Stephen Kotev, along with our guest experts, will share our experiences, raise your awareness, and give you food for thought. We will share with you problem-solving strategies no matter what your situation is. At work, with neighbors or friends, family, and with partners. Tune in or join in the conversation every Tuesday evening. Well, welcome listeners to our conflict chat, ripped from the headlines. I am your host, Pattie Porter, along with my special guest host, Stephen Kotev. The last Tuesday of every month, we discuss the hottest topics in the news, as well as take your live calls to listen to your conflict situation. We give you tips and guidance on your next steps to resolving the problem. Now, tonight we invite you to engage with us. You can do that in a number of ways. You can call us. So if you're listening on the line right now, you can call us at 347-324-3591. That's our phone, and you can press the number 1 key so we know that you want to speak to us. So again, that's 347-324-3591. We also, if you're listening on the computer and haven't noticed, if you just scroll down the page, you'll see the chat room open. I see that someone is in with us now, so welcome guests. And you can leave your comment or questions in the chat box so that we can talk with you that way as well. And finally, you can also tweet us at TXConflictCoach and follow our Twitter feed using the hashtag ConflictChat. So we're excited that you're here with us tonight. You can listen to all our archived programs at texasconflictcoach.com. So I have Stephen back with me. Welcome back to our conflict chat.
Thank you so much for having me, Pattie. It's always a joy to be here.
Well, so tonight we were, Stephen and I were having this conversation about, what could we, pull right from the headlines just a few days ahead of the program so we can have the freshest content, like what's going on out there that's causing a lot of conflict, or that would be, fodder for us to talk about, because we are about conflict management and conflict resolution, and what's going on out in the world and how does it affect everyday people. And so again, unless we get live callers, which we hope you'll do, or again, join us in the chat room and type in your question or conflict about your situation. But we're going to talk about mean tweets, right? Nasty things that people post on Twitter or other social media networks. So did you hear about the Jimmy Kimmel Live or get a chance to watch that, Stephen?
Where they you're talking about where they had President Obama on?
Yes,
Yeah, I did get to see it, and I completely agree with you that of the things that are happening recently, this is a classic one that gets a lot of people in trouble.
Absolutely. So if you did not hear about it, folks, sometimes we don't turn on the television or listen to the radio, and so we're not really privy to what's going on in the world. But Jimmy Kimmel, which has a TV program, a late-night kind of comedy talk show, had President Obama on his show, and this was actually the second time, and I didn't even know this. This is the second time that he had President Obama actually read mean tweets about him. Now, of course, President Obama was very humorous about the whole thing and was reading it with a lot of comedy and fervor. So you can actually see it on YouTube or on the Jimmy Kimmel Live. But what was interesting is, it's not surprising. We didn't have to have the President Obama reading the mean tweets, but it's not surprising that we hear about or even see in our own Twitter feed or maybe our Facebook live feed or Google Plus or whatever social media network you're using, some of the things that people say that, just has you like scratching your head like, I can't believe they just said that. I mean, have you seen that yourself? Because I know you're on social media, Stephen.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I'm trying to remember what the phrase is, but it's something where a lot of times if you're not right next to that person or in the same room as that person, you say things that you wouldn't say. And to me, social media is probably the worst example of that, where people pretty much think they can say whatever they want, and you'll never meet that person. You'll never have to look them in the eye and, in a sense, have to see how your words affect them.
Exactly. And for whatever reason, people in very high public profile, whether that's politicians, celebrities, anyone in a high public profile, will certainly be fodder for a lot of mean, nasty, rude comments. Certainly we have talked about on our show how people have used technology and social media to cyberbully, to do sexting, all kinds of things. So this is not new in terms of what we've talked about on the show, but I want to give a couple of examples from Jimmy Kimmel Live, and then actually show a couple of other examples. I actually looked it up on meanest tweets on Twitter, and so for those of you who didn't get to see the Jimmy Kimmel Live program, here's a couple of things that President Obama was having a little fun with. So the first thing that shows up is, and what was interesting is that they read out loud not only what the tweet said exactly, because people can only write 148 characters, so they're not long. But what people do is they get exposed. Now, we don't know if this is the real person's name, but most times people will put their real picture, their real name, and then their Twitter name. So you get exposed by having written these things. So according to this one, Donald Trump, from his Twitter handle, Real Donald Trump, he said, President Obama will go down as perhaps the worst president in the history of the United States. And, of course, President Obama, he actually responded very funny with, well, at Real Donald Trump, at least I will go down as a president. And then he drops his phone. He did the whole phone drop thing. So it was really quite funny and how he chose to respond to that. Then there's some that are very, totally ridiculous, and you're like, what? So, one said, my mom bought new conditioner, and it sucks. It isn't even conditioning my hair, and I blame Obama. And it's like, what does that have anything to do with Obama? Just people are putting stuff, out there. Sometimes I think it's meant as a joke. Like this gentleman, he said, Barack Obama, bro, do you even lift? Implying, his physique, etc. So those kinds of things, go on and on and on that people will say. And sometimes I think they do it in a joking way, but sometimes I think that their intention is to be, I don't know, fill in the blank. Mean? I don't know. What would be some other intentions that people do this? So.
Yeah, and it is something where you never know what's going on when folks say things. There's obviously some that are meant as a joke, or they're not really blaming that person. It's just something that they feel is an easy target. The one about, okay, my conditioner works, thanks Obama. I've seen this one over and over on Facebook where it doesn't matter what happens, they blame somebody else for it. The airlines are delayed, that's your fault. There was a natural disaster, that's your fault. I see this a lot, in somebody who gets blamed in the office. Usually it's the boss, but it doesn't always have to be the boss. But it'll be like, oh, okay, the reason why my day is miserable is because of somebody else. And, to me, that sort of thanks Obama one is like the classic example of that.
Exactly. It's getting that blame, and a lot of times we sit behind the computers, and like you said, we don't know these people directly, and so there's some kind of, maybe they feel there's an anonymity or a level of safety, or somehow they feel powerful or in power to have a voice, although it's not a voice that's constructive or productive. If anything, it depends on how people look at that. And the implications about these kinds of tweets, is what are the implications for doing this, right? It perpetuates conflict. I mean, either it perpetuates conflict with the individual who it's targeted to, or it kind of has this group think approach, where people start bandwagging on, oh yeah, and then they add and add and add, to the mean tweets. Before you know it, people start to believe some of the things that are on there as if they're fact, when and all it is just opinion or people's perspective, but they're doing it in a very destructive and negative and nasty way.
And that's one of the things that's really, really interesting for me about Twitter is that, fundamentally it's about, communicating with other people. But what we see that's so interesting is that normally if you're having a conversation, you pretty much know who is in the room with you when you have that conversation. For the most part, you know who you're talking to. And once you start getting social media and things like that in, you don't really know who's paying attention because, you have your Twitter followers and, there's a certain number of people who will directly watch it. But now with Twitter, you can quickly retweet something and then it'll go out to a bunch of people who you don't even know whether or not it'll be received and how it'll be received. And there's been situations where people have lost their job because they've, in a sense, made a joke to their close friends, and somehow or another that gets retweeted, and then somebody's boss is looking at that, because the person who tweeted it out originally says where they work, and then, it's like, okay, well, that wasn't the message that I was intending to send to everybody. This was something that was only sent to one person. And when you see all these social media statements that people make, a lot of times they're not taking into account who it is that's actually going to hear it.
Well, I'm so glad that you said that. This whole month has been actually around workplace conflict, and as you were saying, people at work. I don't know how many times we've heard in the media, on Facebook, whatever the venue is, where an employee is upset about their boss, something that they did, or maybe they're upset about something completely different, but they speak on behalf of the company, and that gets them in trouble. And that's part of being out there in the social media world, is that you are exposed. You are putting your information out there, your thoughts, your opinions. Even if you, let's say, I was talking to someone not too long ago about how they were masking their identity by having another name. And I said, but you have to be really careful, because if your picture is up there, people can find you. I mean, they can still track you. They can still find where you might be showing up, even if you're, for example, my Twitter handle is TX Conflict Coach. It's not Pattie Porter. But because of my presence in this, in the technology internet world, people can easily find out that I'm Pattie Porter. So if I was, texting, social media, whatever it is that I'm doing, and I'm putting out nasty opinions, they're going to quickly find me. So I'm going to be exposed. And there's been a lot of employees who've been fired because of the nasty, mean types of tweets that they've made about other people, or that they've made about their company or about their boss. So people, you have to be aware that you're not hidden. You're not anonymous.
Well, and that's a really big generational thing that I think is also important. As we're getting closer to the holidays, as we're thinking about who we work with, I see a real big generational difference between how, say, a Gen Xer and a millennial, stereotypically, there's always going to be somebody who says, oh, not me. But overall, if you look at how a millennial looks at social media, they pretty much put everything up out there. And, you can find out what they had for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They've got stuff like Instagram where, there's constant feed of things that are coming up. And, there's a lot that people put out about themselves. And that in and of itself is a big difference for somebody who wasn't used to that and isn't used to that, somebody who maybe is a little bit older. And there is that thing of, okay, well, what actually are people paying attention to? Because, a lot of times the advice that people are given is like, well, you really shouldn't put that out there because then it's permanent, quote unquote. But I think some folks don't even think about, okay, well, if I put that out there, if I say that, is anybody going to pay attention to it? But this whole thing with mean tweets, right? That was basically somebody who said something about the president, but who's like, well, who's paying attention? Well, this big TV show. Jimmy Kimmel was paying attention, and lo and behold, here's the president reading the thing that you were saying about them, and how many folks thought that that's what was going to happen to them.
Right, and imagine how embarrassing that must have been for them to have it read out loud. Not only read out loud, but their Twitter handle, most of them had their names attached to it. Now, they might think, oh, I made television or whatever, and some people might thought, oh, that was just a joke. They took it too seriously. And that's something that often happens and not just in the workplace, but in a lot of things where people will use that type of abrasion, if you will, or aggression because they're upset about something, and they'll use sarcasm or inappropriate humor, and it's just, oh, that was just a joke. I really didn't mean it, but really there was something inside that had some, piece of truth for that. So maybe this Twitter or Facebook is this outlet for them because they don't feel safe being able to have a voice. But when they do have a voice, they do it in a way that's very destructive. Now, I was going to share a couple things on mean tweets, actually, about other people. But before we do that, you are tuned in to the Texas Conflict Coach Blog Talk Radio program, and this is our monthly conflict chat ripped from the headlines. And Stephen Kotev and I are talking about mean and nasty tweets. Have you yourself ever posted nasty tweets? And maybe, you have to think about, do I intend it to be that way? We see kids, in our Back to School series that we do every August, we talk a lot about, and there's a lot of education out there about, educating young folks, because you were talking about the generation gap and how the younger folks will use these venues as a way to communicate. But there has to be this level of education about how are we doing that and how are we using that, taking that power, but to abuse it. In fact, we next year, as we're starting to plan for next year, there's actually National Safer Internet Day, and we found an organization called Cyber Smile Foundation, and they're all about raising education and awareness about how are we using the internet in a safe way and how we engage with people. So I look forward to hoping and having to have them there to educate us more. So when I was looking at mean tweets, there's actually a Twitter handle, Meanest Tweets. And I was just, most of it I think is usually around celebrities. It doesn't matter whether television or movie or, music. But for example, this one was actually on U.S. women's basketball. And it was a tweet. What they do is they retweet and put it all in one thread. And someone wrote in here, I'm pretty sure U.S. women's basketball should be illegal, right? I'm like, what? Who would write that? Now I'm going to all these places because here's the thing. We make assumptions about what these things mean. And I might make the wrong assumption about what that means and then add another piece to the thread, right? And then it can go in all kinds of different nasty directions. So that was one. And then the other one was Ryan Seacrest is an embarrassment to women everywhere. And I'm like, so I'm reading these and I'm like, I'm almost in this, oh my gosh moment, like people really write this stuff? But they do.
Well, and it's the thing of if you're with your friends at a bar and you've had a couple drinks, people will say some stuff that they think is kind of funny. Again, like with the President Obama, there's certain people who deliberately wanted to go and insult the guy, and they were pretty good at it. Most of the time, though, when you're dealing with people, especially people that you see every day, they don't forget this stuff. I think a lot of times people feel like, oh, well, I put it on social media and who cares? But there are people who care. And I think, as folks who deal with people who have problems all the time and people who get upset about what happens to them, this is where I really feel like it's an important thing for people to take notice of because, it sort of sounds like a good idea at the time, but usually it doesn't go over the way you want it to. And then it's like, well, do you want to deal with this? Do you want to have to answer to somebody or have them, make a decision about you, make an opinion of you that, you don't really think is true? And I think that's a lot of times where I think folks really need to pause and think about it before they do it.
Now, the interesting thing is that here's another impact. So we talked about how does it, one, you become exposed. Two, people assume or make interpretations about you and your motivation for saying these things. And then it perpetuates the conflict in that, it can literally become a feud online, right? And not just online, but it can also, move into something even worse offline. And I think people need to be aware that things can be blown out of proportion very, very quickly. And certainly we've seen that, again, with very high-profile, celebrities. But we see and hear, and of course we hear about that more often because that's what makes the media and journalism and news. But there's a lot of people who've been just normal, everyday people who have been at the brunt of these types of fighting and picking and feuding, and then just like you would, like, for example, in the workplace, we start feuding with each other. Well, my friend believes in me, and before you know it, we have two cliques, and we're polarized, and this group is over here, and this group is over here, and in the virtual world, you have that same dynamic that's happening, and people are lashing out. They're hashtagging it, right? They're they're making snide remarks. They're giving maybe cryptic messages, and sometimes very ambiguous, and people read into that, and it just grows to something very nasty, and sometimes hopefully not in a way where someone gets injured by it in any physical manner, but we've heard about those things as well.
Yeah, I often feel that with the social media situation, you're creating a distance that a lot of times people aren't even paying attention to. And, the interesting thing for me about the whole mean tweets, because, Jimmy Kimmel has done, lots of different actors and actresses and have them put them out there. And fundamentally, they're people like anybody else. And they are, putting themselves out in the public eye and all that stuff. But basically, they hurt just like anybody else. And I think sometimes we don't realize that because, in a sense, it's like we want the quick attention. We want the retweet. We want the laugh. We want to get a bunch of likes. And, you can do that. And there's people who basically, that's what they do for fun, and we call them trolls. That's what the internet has named them. And literally all they want to do is get bad attention.
And that could very well be true. Now, if you are someone who is at the brunt of that, first of all, my suggestion would be not to engage in that, because I think what we do is we go into defensive mode. We're trying to protect our reputation. We're trying to protect who we are. You got the whole Kardashian thing that there was an article about, did she fake some, theft that was in Paris, and now she's suing the journalist who wrote the article, and et cetera, and of course it's all over the place, But if you are, just an everyday person, right? I know we're talking about celebrities, we're talking about public officials and things of that nature, and we've known over the years and the work that we've done around cyberbullying and raising awareness around sexting, things of that nature, that people really do get very hurt by this, and with youth, that can end up in suicide because they take those things so seriously. So the first thing I would suggest is disengage. Don't even engage or feel compelled that you have to defend your reputation. On one hand, you want to defend your reputation, but I think you have to be very careful because you could really feed the Twitter mean, nasty, nasty posts, and then it just gets worse and worse and worse. And so if you have to defend yourself, you have to think about how am I going to do that, and at what point do I disengage from it?
Yeah, and a real good rule of thumb in dealing with social media is you want to make an offer to talk with them offline. If you're getting somebody who's trolling you, you want to go and you want to be able to say, hey, I'm happy to talk to you off the internet. And you want to make that offer publicly. So if you're getting trolled, you want to make that offer publicly, whatever the forum is, to say, hey, let's talk about this offline. And then, if they troll you again, you make the same offer. If they troll you a third time, you don't respond. Because I think what people don't realize is that a lot of folks who are trolling, they just want the attention. And I think that's one of the things that's very easy to happen when you get into conflict with people. When you legitimately get angry about something, it's like somebody has gone and literally hooked you. They've got you right by the cheek and they're pulling you along. And when you do that, you start acting in a way that is the exact opposite of what you need to do. And that feeds exactly into what they want.
Well, and I'm so glad you brought up the word troll or trolling or internet troll, because it's no different than when you're in a workplace and you're emailing or you're, because people, when they get into conflict, they don't want to talk to each other, so they avoid each other, but now they hide behind their emails. And it's a different, so trolling is more like that internet, as you said, offensive internet exchange, but it's taking that bait. A lot of times in my training or coaching, I'm like, are you taking the bait? Do you recognize the bait? Remember, that's an ink fish. That's probably not the right word for the fish, but those fish or octopus that put out ink and you're like, stay away from it, don't take the bait. And that's what you're basically saying, is don't take the trolling bait, that's going on. So that's a great strategy and a great tip around that. But it's the same thing that we see in the workplace, but it's just in a different format. It's a different world that we're living in right now.
Well, what's important about that is that if you show that you want to engage, and you want to engage in a sense of, I don't want to say a grown-up manner, in a mature manner, in a manner that isn't about, in a sense, sort of acting like they do. If you're going to try to handle it like an adult, and you do that, and then they don't respond, then it's obvious that all they're really about is hurting you. And there may be some people who think that's great, and there may be some people who think that's the most terrible thing in the world. But the remaining, group of folks, which is usually like, between 60 and 80%, aren't really going to pay attention to it anymore. And then, that person, that troll, doesn't have the power. But it has to come back to you to make that choice of, okay, what's my self-worth? What's important to me? How do I want to behave? And does this really matter? Because I think a lot of times, especially if you're young, what people say about you they think is true. And that's what you were talking about before about people committing suicide. And that's just tragic.
Yeah, that it is, especially with really, young, and not just, we're not just talking teenagers or people in middle school. I mean, even adults who didn't grow up in this world, in this online world, and they're like, wow, why are they targeting me? Why are they? And maybe they didn't even know that person, but it can be very, very tragic. And so one of the strategies you just shared, and I want to emphasize again as we start to look at closing the program, is engage publicly with, let's talk offline. I'd like to work this through with you, or I want to understand, why you're upset with me, so that they see that the person is responding in a way instead of, attacking with more, inflammatory remarks or blaming, you're using your defense strategy in a destructive way. Publicly say, let's talk offline. Let's private message each other on Facebook. Let's get on LinkedIn. Let's get on Skype if you want to talk. I wouldn't necessarily say, hey, let's go meet in person somewhere, especially if it's someone that's a stranger. I don't know that I would feel safe about that. But I would definitely say let's talk offline, about what's going on, and is there something going on that I'm unaware of that's happened that you're targeting me, and if it is a complete stranger, you have no idea who they are, and maybe they've seen some profile and they're like you said, trolling, baiting you. I think part of it is like, is this a time to disengage? Is this a time to even notify? Facebook has some real good safety measures. LinkedIn has some good safety measures. I'm not sure about Twitter. I would imagine they do. I'm not as up to date about that, and maybe Stephen. But I know if you were to reach out to Facebook or Google Plus or LinkedIn, if there was an issue, that they would definitely take down any threads or protect someone. So, but I'm not sure about Twitter.
Yeah, I think I'm sure that there's a way to report abusive behavior, and there's a Twitter help center. And if you just go and Google that stuff will come up. They they do try to monitor that kind of stuff. So you do have some recourse. You should have some recourse through whatever platform you're using. Again, I wouldn't put any faith in that, in the sense of a lot of times you're going to have situations where they may or may not be as responsive as you want. And I feel like a lot of the real things that are important is for you to pay attention to yourself. And a lot of times when people are doing things and saying things that are really nasty to you, you have to kind of sit back and say, well, how much power am I giving them? I know of situations where, especially with women, where there'll be women in certain positions where there'll be there'll be a writer, there'll be a movie director, and they'll be sort of taken apart as being terrible. And, they will say this person is horrible, and the woman has to be able to sort of say, I'm not afraid of you. And that's an easy thing to say, and it's sometimes going to be a really hard thing to do. But when you show that it doesn't get under your skin, all that type of nasty stuff that folks say to you, it really loses a lot of power.
Yeah, absolutely. I did just look up very, very quickly. Twitter does have a way to not only report abusive behavior or messages, but they do say that if you've received a threat, a credible threat that you fear for your own or somebody else's physical safety, they strongly encourage you to contact local law enforcement. And I as I understand, local law enforcement is really getting on top of this whole social media and technology and looking at these things much more seriously. Certainly in the cyberbullying world, there are even some states that have laws against that, and people can be, charged with different levels of misdemeanor or even federal crimes. But they say here on Twitter that law enforcement will make sure, check kind of the validity of the threat, investigate the source, especially if it's ongoing. And so that was one of the suggestions they make in terms of those types of threats. But there definitely is some things around, filing a report, abusive messages. But, how well they respond to that, I'm really not sure. But they definitely have a whole set of policies there that you can go to the support.twitter.com about what you should do if you find yourself in that manner. So any other final things that are coming to mind for you, Stephen, in terms of other tips or strategies from what we've already talked about?
I would say in many circumstances, when you see this stuff and you start to take it personal, take a break, walk away. Talk to somebody who you really know and care and who really cares about you, and let them help you take a look at what's being said. Because a lot of times people make things a lot worse than they need to be. You have to take it into account. Well, who is saying this? What does it matter? And a lot of times we have to realize, it's not that important. It's not something that really tells you and defines who you are. So, when you're in those circumstances where somebody's making some sort of insinuations about you or those type of things, really take a breath. Get out of that emotional state for a second and give yourself a chance to really settle down. And once you do, you're going to probably see it in a totally different light.
No, absolutely. Taking that step back is for sure, and that's a common strategy we give a lot of people, even in face-to-face conflict. Take a step back, take a breath, and then think about how you want to approach, this situation differently. And it's really using some of the same strategies, but in an online world. And you do have resources, and there are policies, and there is help out there, so you're not alone if you find yourself in this situation that we've been talking about today. So, Stephen, thank you so much for having this conversation with me today, and thank you, guests, for joining us in the chat room. I appreciate our graduate intern who is live tweeting for us tonight. Thank you, Ann. Listeners, we invite you to browse our podcast library and see our upcoming Tuesday night programs at Texas conflictcoach.com. In November, we're really focused on holiday conflicts. We have a great variety of speakers on a variety of ways that conflict shows up, whether in your family, in your workplace. Even Stephen and I are going to talk about the day after the elections on November 8th. We're going to talk about how do you handle some of those conversations the day after. So I'm looking forward to doing that with you, Stephen.
Absolutely. I think that's a really important one. This election has been a really very, very passionate, very, very difficult time for everybody. And somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose. So tune in. We're going to do it actually on the 8th, and we'll give you some really good tips for how to keep it together if you win and how to handle it if you don't.
Now that's going to be an exciting show that night, especially with the TV on. You're seeing the numbers, and we're like, okay, guys, let's get ready for tomorrow. Definitely the day after. Stephen, this was a lot of fun tonight. Really enjoyed learning some things even from you as I was kind of researching it as you were talking, and just hopefully, listeners, that you taken some strategies away and some things to think about if you find yourself in this situation. Listeners, we encourage you to embrace conflict courageously and address it constructively. So until next time. Thank you for listening to the Texas Conflict Coach. We hope you enjoyed the program. You can find all of our podcasts archived to listen at your convenience at texasconflictcoach.com or download the podcast at iTunes or Stitcher Radio. You can also become a Facebook fan of Conflict Connection or Twitter me at TX Conflict Coach.